Ethan Cole, a 32-year-old millionaire CEO with piercing blue eyes and neatly styled black hair, stepped into the graveyard on a cloudy afternoon, his sky-blue tailored suit almost too polished for the somber ground beneath him. In his hand, he carried white lilies, the flowers Lillian had once adored, and as he walked slowly along the narrow path, guilt clung to him heavier than the gray clouds above. He hadn't been here in years. Every time he thought of visiting, shame pulled him back, whispering reminders of the way he had chosen wealth over love, success over her. Now, standing before the cold stone marked with Lillian Cole, his breath faltered, and the weight of unspoken apologies pressed hard on his chest. Kneeling, he placed the lilies gently down, his hand brushing the engraved name, and for a moment he let himself whisper the words he never said while she was alive. "I should have been better." The wind stirred, carrying petals across the ground, and just as he bowed his head in regret, a sound shattered the silence, a soft, broken cry. Ethan's eyes lifted sharply, scanning the quiet rows until they landed on a sight that froze him in place. Just a few feet away stood two little girls, identical twins, no older than 6, their dresses faded, one pink and the other light blue, their small hands clasped tightly together. Golden hair, tangled by the wind, framed their tear-streaked faces as their shoulders shook with grief. Ethan's breath caught. He had come expecting solitude, yet here were two children mourning at the very same grave. His heart pounded as he strained to hear their whispers, and when one choked out, "Mom, we miss you," and the other sobbed, "Why did you leave us?" his knees nearly buckled, his throat tightened, his chest twisted with a pain he could not name, and he finally found the courage to step closer, his voice low and trembling. Why are you standing here?" The taller twin lifted her tearful eyes toward him, her lips quivering as she looked down at the grave and whispered, "Because this is our mother's grave." Ethan's world tilted, his heart thundered, and as he stared at their fragile faces, faces that carried a strange and haunting familiarity, he realized this visit was not just about flowers and apologies. It was the beginning of a mystery that would change his life forever. Ethan's breath grew shallow as his knees bent to the ground, the weight of the moment pressing him down harder than gravity itself, and with his voice trembling, he managed to whisper, "Why are you standing here?" The taller girl sniffled and wiped her cheeks with the back of her small hand, her golden strands of hair sticking to the tears on her face, and in a fragile voice she whispered, "This is our mother's grave." Ethan felt his pulse slam in his ears, but before he could even react, the other twin lifted her head, her voice cracked with innocence and pain, and she murmured, "She used to tell us stories before bed. Now she's gone." The words sliced through Ethan like glass, each syllable tearing open wounds he didn't know he carried, and suddenly the graveyard felt colder, lonelier, as if even the earth mourned with them. His chest tightened. These children spoke of Lillian with such intimacy, such raw love, it made the air between them electric with questions. He studied their tiny faces, every feature a puzzle piece that threatened to form a picture he wasn't ready to see. Sophie's trembling lips, Clara's wide, frightened eyes, together they mirrored a reflection of something terrifyingly familiar, and Ethan's heart hammered harder. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft sobs of the girls, and Ethan found himself clutching the edge of the grave, as though the stone itself might anchor him to reality. How could Lillian have daughters he never knew about? The thought roared in his mind like thunder, but he couldn't voice it. Instead, he swallowed, his throat dry, his words fragile as glass when he finally whispered, "Who is your father?" The question hung in the air, heavy, almost cruel in its weight, and the twins stiffened as though it was a forbidden secret. Sophie glanced at Clara nervously, her fingers tightening around her sister's hand as though she drew courage from the touch, and her lips pressed together, trembling as she searched for words that wouldn't come. Clara's lower lip quivered, her eyes filling again, and she shook her head softly, as though the answer was too painful to speak aloud. Ethan's gaze darted between them, desperate for clarity, his own fear mixing with a strange sense of recognition he couldn't shake. The girls exchanged a glance that only siblings could understand, one full of silent communication, of shared grief, and Sophie whispered at last, "Mom never told us about him." Her words were barely audible, a breath carried on the wind, but they struck Ethan like a hammer. Clara, her small voice breaking, added, "She just said, he wasn't there when we needed him." Ethan's chest constricted, his breath faltered, and his entire body felt frozen, like the ground beneath him had given way. He looked at them, two fragile souls standing in their innocence, and something inside him shattered. His mind screamed with disbelief, but his heart whispered truths he wasn't ready to face. The twins' eyes stared back at him, wet and glistening, reflecting pain that seemed far too heavy for children to bear, and Ethan realized this wasn't coincidence. It wasn't chance. This was destiny forcing a truth to the surface, one he could no longer avoid. Ethan's body stiffened as Clara's fragile whisper lingered in the air, each word cutting into his chest like a wound that refused to heal, her soft voice trembling as she admitted that their mother had never spoken of a father, only of a shadowy absence, a figure who wasn't there when they needed him most, and Ethan's breath caught, his throat tightening with a guilt he didn't yet understand, his sharp blue eyes clouding with a storm of regret and disbelief as memories of Lillian flashed before him, her laughter, her tears, the way she used to hold his hand during their brightest days. Yet all of it felt like it was shattering now under the unbearable weight of what these innocent children revealed, and as he tried to compose himself, to mask the emotions clawing at his chest, his mind raced with unanswerable questions. How could Lillian have carried such a truth and buried it away from him? Why hadn't he known? Why hadn't she told him? And the graveyard's silence pressed heavier than the gray clouds above, the wind carrying whispers of sorrow that seemed to echo the girls' pain, their little faces streaked with tears as they clung to the gravestone like it was the last thread tying them to their mother's memory. And Ethan, overwhelmed, staggered back a step, telling himself he should leave, that this wasn't his place, that maybe fate was playing some cruel game with his conscience. Yet as he turned, heart pounding in chaos, he felt the small, trembling hand of Sophie clutching his sleeve, stopping him cold, and when he turned, her innocent eyes, so hauntingly familiar, looked up at him with a strange recognition, her lips quivering as she whispered words that froze the air around him. "Wait, you look just like us." And in that moment, Ethan's world collapsed, for the possibility that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind suddenly roared to life, shaking the ground beneath his very soul. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter than he realized as he pulled into his long, empty driveway, the mansion looming before him like a silent judge, and when he shut off the engine, the quiet was deafening, filled only with the pounding of his heart. He dragged himself inside, climbed the stairs, and stood before the mirror, staring at the face he'd built his empire with, the sharp jawline, the cold blue eyes, the black hair combed immaculately back. Yet all he could see now was the uncanny reflection he had witnessed in those little girls, the innocence in their gaze mirroring his own features, and suddenly the mirror no longer reflected a man of power but a man haunted by ghosts of choices he could never undo, and as he pressed his palm against the glass, flashes of the past assaulted him, the night Lillian had stood in the rain outside his office, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged him to come home instead of signing another deal, his own voice rising in anger as he accused her of being ungrateful, the sharp slam of the door when he walked out, choosing ambition over the fragile thread of their love, the memory of her soft voice cracking when she whispered that she couldn't fight for them alone, and how he had turned away, too blinded by pride to see the truth. Now, standing before the mirror years later, his chest tightened as her face resurfaced in his mind, her gentle smile, her resilience, the way she used to brush his hair off his forehead while whispering he was more than his wealth, and he whispered brokenly, "Did I abandon more than just her?" As if the reflection might answer, but the silence was crushing, and in that silence he heard echoes of laughter that never reached his ears, stories that were told without him, milestones missed, birthdays celebrated with an empty chair where a father should have been, and the weight of all that absence pressed against his ribs until he staggered back from the mirror, unable to breathe, stumbling into the study where the shelves of untouched books seemed to accuse him of the life he had built on emptiness, of boardroom victories and hollow accolades that meant nothing compared to the possibility that he had unknowingly abandoned his own children. He sank into the leather chair, head in his hands, and a storm of memories clashed with what he had just seen at the graveyard. their eyes, their voices, their pain, and for the first time his empire felt meaningless, his success a brittle crown on a guilty king. Dawn crept through the window, painting the room in pale gold, but Ethan hadn't slept, his mind circling relentlessly around the same truth he refused to admit aloud, that the twins might be his daughters, the living proof of his failures, and yet perhaps also the only chance left to redeem himself. Though fear clawed at him, what if they rejected him? What if Lillian had poisoned their hearts against him? What if he was too late to be anything more than a stranger? And as the morning grew brighter, so too did his determination, because no matter the truth, he needed to know, he had to uncover what had been hidden, to face the consequences of his abandonment, and so with trembling hands he scribbled down the cemetery's address, resolving that when the sun set again, he would follow those girls from the distance, not to intrude, not yet to claim, but to watch, to learn, to piece together the life that had unfolded without him. And though fear gnawed at him, a small flame of hope flickered in his chest, that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to discover whether blood still tied him to the daughters he never knew he had. Ethan's car sat parked a short distance from the small, aging house, his grip tight around the steering wheel, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality, his heart pounding in a rhythm he hadn't felt since the night he signed the divorce papers years ago. He watched the twins walk inside with the energy of childhood, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, and the sight of them disappearing through that modest wooden door made his chest ache with a pain that felt like punishment for choices he could never undo, choices that had carved a canyon between him and the life that could have been his. Yet still he stayed, eyes fixed on the warm glow of light flickering through the curtains, listening to the faint laughter spilling into the night as though every giggle was a reminder of what he had abandoned. Through the window, he caught glimpses of Sophie tugging Clara's hand toward the dining table where Margaret, gray-haired and weary yet radiant with a grandmother's love, placed bowls of soup before them, her smile filled with quiet resilience, her hands trembling slightly but steady enough to care for two children who deserved the world. And Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he noticed how little they had. Simple food, worn furniture, cracked walls. But how much joy filled the air, for the girls leaned into each other, whispering secrets, breaking into bursts of laughter, their innocence unshaken by the absence of the father who should have been there to carry the weight. Ethan leaned forward, straining to hear, every muscle in his body tense when Margaret reached across the table, gently cupping Clara's cheek, whispering words so soft he almost doubted them. Your daddy would be proud if he ever knew. And the moment shattered him, split his soul wide open like glass under pressure, because deep down, he knew there was no mistaking the truth anymore. Those words weren't just a tender lie to soothe the girls, they were a dagger into his heart, confirming what his mind had fought to deny. These children, laughing and smiling inside that little house, were his, and he had missed it all. Their first cries, their first steps, their first birthdays, their first broken hearts, and the silence of years roared inside him louder than any storm, louder than the accusations and pride that once drove him to walk away from Lillian, louder than the applause of business deals that never filled the hollow in his chest, louder than the excuses he told himself to survive. His breath quickened as images flooded his mind, Lillian standing at the doorway the day he left, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she begged him to listen, his pride choking him, blinding him, deafening him, to the truth she may have tried to tell, and now, staring into the life he had unknowingly abandoned, Ethan felt the full weight of what it meant to be haunted by ghosts not of death but of neglect, of arrogance, of a love thrown away. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, tears he hadn't shed in years stinging his eyes, his reflection in the rearview mirror showing not the powerful CEO the world knew, but a man broken, a man stripped of excuses, a man who had finally collided with the consequences of his own making, and still, he couldn't move, couldn't knock on the door, couldn't cross the distance that now felt like 1,000 miles, because fear gripped him, fear of rejection, fear that the girls would turn away, fear that Margaret would slam the door in his face, fear that Lillian would never forgive. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a pull, an ache, a desperate longing to make it right before time stole the chance completely. His chest tightened as Sophie suddenly turned toward the window, her curious eyes catching a flicker of movement outside, and Ethan froze, his breath trapped, heart racing as though the universe had forced him into a corner, the girl tilting her head with a frown that mirrored his own, then brushing it off with the innocence of a child too wrapped in joy to suspect that the man outside was more than a stranger. Ethan exhaled sharply, knowing this was only the beginning, knowing that tomorrow he had to decide: step into their world and face the storm of truth, or keep living as a ghost of the father he had never been. But as he sat there, gripping the steering wheel, one thought echoed louder than all others, haunting, relentless, undeniable. He had already lost too much time, and every second he delayed was another second stolen from the daughters who unknowingly carried his face, his blood, his heart. Ethan's knuckles trembled after knocking, his chest rising and falling like a man caught between two storms, and when Margaret opened the door, her expression froze, lips parting in disbelief as though the past itself had stepped onto her porch. His presence alone was enough to turn the air heavy, her frail hands gripping the wooden frame for strength, her voice shaking as she whispered his name. Ethan. A name laced with both shock and unspoken pain, and when she studied his face the resemblance was undeniable. Those same piercing blue eyes that stared back at her every time she looked at the girls. Yet Ethan stood there torn, confused, heart pounding as if demanding answers, and Margaret's gaze softened but filled with sorrow, her breath trembling as she confessed what had been buried for years. You don't know, do you? Words that sent shivers crawling across Ethan's skin, because he suddenly realized there was something much deeper than guilt hidden beneath her tone, and before he could respond Margaret's tears spilled, running down her cheeks like rivers of grief finally set free, her voice breaking as she said, "Lillian was pregnant when you left her." And those words cracked the silence like thunder, cutting Ethan down to his core, his breath choking in his throat as every choice he made, every cold word he uttered, every step he took away from love and toward ambition suddenly turned into a blade cutting him open, because now he saw the cost was not just the woman he abandoned, but the innocent lives he never knew existed. And as Margaret continued, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her apron, she revealed the truth he wasn't prepared to face. Sophie and Clara, they're your daughters. A revelation so heavy Ethan staggered back as though gravity itself had betrayed him, his chest tightening with the weight of years wasted, of birthdays missed, of lullabies unsung, and the world spun around him until the laughter he'd heard through the window just hours ago now echoed in his skull like haunting reminders of moments stolen from him by his own blindness. And suddenly, the room fell into silence so thick it suffocated, but then a sound broke through, soft footsteps creaking on the wooden floorboards, and when Ethan turned his head, there they stood, Sophie and Clara, the twins he had mistaken for strangers, now gazing at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, their faces pale with shock, their little hands gripping each other tightly as though clinging to the only certainty they had in that moment, and the truth hung in the air like shattered glass between them, dangerous, fragile, irreversible, and Ethan's throat ached to speak, but no words came, only the silent scream of regret echoing inside his soul as he realized the children who mirrored his face had been searching for a father their whole lives without knowing he was standing just beyond the shadows. Ethan's knees pressed against the wooden floor as tears rolled down his cheeks, his arms trembling as if the weight of years of absence bore down upon them, and though his heart longed to gather both Sophie and Clara in an embrace that would erase all the scars of time, he knew nothing could be undone. Yet when Clara's small steps echoed forward and her tiny hands wrapped around his neck, the dam inside him broke, and soon Sophie, hesitant at first, joined her sister, their fragile arms encircling him, and for the first time in years Ethan felt the warmth of home, not the kind bought with money or built with success, but the kind that pulsed in their steady heartbeats against his chest. And though joy surged, Margaret's words cut sharply through the fragile moment, her weary voice trembling yet firm. "It's not enough to cry, Ethan. What will you do for them now?" And he lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes meeting hers, guilt and determination battling in his soul, because he realized she was right. His presence was not a gift, it was a responsibility, one he had abandoned long ago. And he whispered, choking on his words, "I will do everything I can to make it right." But Margaret shook her head slowly, pain etched into the lines of her face. "Promises are easy, Ethan, but these girls need more than words. They've grown without a father, without the security you could have given, and now they need stability, love, and sacrifice." And his chest burned as he looked at the modest home, at the worn furniture, at the quiet strength of this woman who had carried burdens that belonged to him, and he felt the crushing shame of a man who once had everything yet gave nothing where it mattered. And as Sophie looked up at him with wide, tearful eyes, she asked in a small voice, "Will you stay with us? Or will you leave again?" And Ethan shook his head desperately, pulling them closer. Never again, not for anything in this world. But still he felt the weight of proving it, of turning words into living truth, so he turned to Margaret, his voice steady now. "Let me shoulder this with you. Let me provide. Let me be here, not just as a visitor, but as their father." Yet Margaret remained silent, her silence louder than any rejection, testing his resolve, and in that silence Ethan remembered the nights he had buried himself in work, chasing deals, climbing towers of wealth, while somewhere Lillian had carried his children, alone, abandoned, and the thought nearly drove him mad. But Sophie gently touched his face, whispering, "Mom said you were kind once." And Clara added, "She said you loved us, even if you weren't here." And those words pierced deeper than any reproach, because Lillian had shielded them from his failure with grace, and he broke down again, whispering her name like a prayer. "Lillian, forgive me." And Margaret's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she said, "If you truly mean it, Ethan, prove it by being present, by being more than your regret, because regret feeds no child." And Ethan nodded, standing, holding the twins' hands, declaring, "From this moment, I will fight for them, I will protect them, and I will give Tian Hem the father they deserve." And as the girls clung to him tighter, Margaret finally sighed, as though releasing years of silent battles. "Then perhaps they can still have the family Lillian dreamed for them." And outside, the fading sunlight cast golden rays through the window, bathing them in warmth, as if the universe itself blessed the reunion. Yet deep inside Ethan knew this was only the beginning of a long road, that love would not erase years but could build new ones, and with trembling resolve he whispered to his daughters, "We will heal together." As Margaret watched, hope and caution mingling in her tired eyes, and the twins finally smiled through their tears, their innocence restoring a broken man, their forgiveness becoming the seed of a future where pain was no longer the last word, but love was. Ethan woke the next morning with a heavy heart but a clear mind, the weight of Margaret's words and his daughter's tearful eyes pressing on his chest like an unshakable burden, and without hesitation he walked past the garage where his gleaming luxury car sat, polished to perfection, a symbol of pride and status, and instead of admiring it as he once would, he felt only disgust at how empty it all was compared to the warmth of two little hands that had clung to him the night before. So he picked up the keys, drove it silently through the quiet streets of the city, and stopped at the dealership where he handed them over, not for profit, not for the rush of a new toy, but as a declaration that his old life of selfishness and ignorance was over. And when he received the funds, he immediately met with a lawyer, explaining in a trembling voice that he wanted to set up a trust fund for Sophie and Clara's education, their futures, their security, because if he could not rewrite the lost years, he could at least give them a future built on love, sacrifice, and responsibility. And as the lawyer drafted the documents, Ethan signed with tears blurring his eyes, realizing that for the first time in his life, every stroke of ink on paper actually meant something, not for him, but for the little girls who had unknowingly carried his blood and his absence all these years. And when he left the office, the city seemed different, less cold, less empty, almost as if Lillian's spirit was walking beside him, approving of his choices, urging him to keep going. And so he returned to Margaret's house where Sophie and Clara were quietly eating breakfast, their eyes still swollen from crying, their hearts still unsure. But when he knelt beside them and whispered softly that he had made sure they would never have to fear being abandoned, never have to worry about their dreams, the girls looked at him with a mix of confusion and hope, as though testing if this change in him was real. And Margaret watched silently from the corner, her arms folded, her expression unreadable, until Ethan asked gently if he could take the girls somewhere important. And she nodded reluctantly, saying only, "If you truly mean what you say, then show them with actions, not just words. And so later that afternoon, with Sophie on his left hand and Clara on his right, he walked slowly toward the graveyard, the gates creaking open as the cool wind brushed against their faces, and with every step Ethan's heart tightened because he knew what awaited him. Lillian's name carved in stone, a silent witness to his failures, his blindness, his cowardice, and when they reached the simple grave, the twins instinctively let go of his hands and rushed forward, kneeling to place the flowers they had brought, fresh and vibrant against the gray stone, and Ethan stood there frozen, his throat closing, his chest trembling, until finally he lowered himself to the ground, knees pressed into the dirt, hands shaking as he reached out and traced the letters of her name with the same tenderness he wished he had shown her when she was alive, whispering through sobs, "Lillian, I led you once, but I swear to you, I will never fail them again." And the words cracked something deep inside him, releasing years of regret, grief, and guilt that poured out in silent tears down his face. And when he finally looked up, Sophie and Clara were staring at him with wide, tearful eyes. But there was a softness there now, a flicker of belief that maybe this man wasn't just the stranger they had been told about, maybe he truly was their father, and Clara reached out first, her small hand resting on his shoulder, followed by Sophie, who pressed her palm over his, and the three of them stayed there in silence, united in grief and in a fragile new bond that Lillian's memory had rekindled. And as the sun slowly dipped behind the trees, casting a golden glow across the graveyard, the girls faintly smiled for the first time in days, their faces no longer only carrying sorrow, but a hint of peace. And Ethan felt warmth surge through him, the kind he hadn't felt in decades, a warmth that whispered to him that redemption, though late, was still possible, that family was not lost forever if he chose to fight for it every single day. And when they finally stood up, brushing the dirt off their clothes, Ethan held their hands tightly, afraid to ever let go again, and together they walked out of the graveyard, step by step into the fading light, and with each stride, Ethan no longer felt like the millionaire defined by wealth, pride, and hollow victories, but like a man reborn into the role he should have embraced long ago, not a businessman, not a tycoon, but simply a father. And as the iron gates closed behind them, Sophie squeezed his hand softly and Clara leaned into his side, and Ethan knew, with unshakable certainty, that he had finally found what all the money in the world could never buy, the love of his daughters, the forgiveness of a broken past, and the chance to live the rest of his days not in regret but in redemption.